All right, let's talk about magnetic susceptibility. So look at this image in front of you. Essentially, it's an in vitro representation of a blood vessel and of the tissue surrounding a blood vessel. So for example, sort of the white long cylinder, the little pipette, you would imagine that this is a blood vessel somewhere inside your brain. And this gray cylinder around it is just a piece of tissue, perhaps a piece of brain, that is surrounding that blood vessel. So maybe this is a, who knows, a capillary. And this is just some brain that is nearby that capillary. And this will allow us to study what happens as we change amounts of, for example, deoxygenated hemoglobin, what happens to the protons in the capillary and surrounding the capillary, so in the brain tissue. So this is an image of exactly what I showed you a moment ago, just it's seen from above. So this small circle is that little central cylinder, the little pipette, that white cylinder that I showed earlier. So this is the blood vessel. And this is that gray cylinder from the previous slide, which is essentially a small piece of brain tissue. Right? So it's the exact same image, we're just looking at it from above. Now, the colors that you see on here represent the phase of where protons are inside this image. For us, it's more convenient to think about it in a slightly different term. For us, it's more convenient to imagine that the colors in this image tell you how strong the magnetic field is in that particular piece of the image. Okay, so the gray, the black, and the white in here tell you how strong is the magnetic field in each little pixel of this image. And remember, we're going to put protons in there, okay? And protons resonate at the Larmor frequency, which is a function of how strong the magnetic field is. For example, let's take a proton. Well, here it is. Now, this proton happens to be in this sort of dark gray part of the field, and so is resonating at a certain Larmor frequency. And here I'm using the color of the proton to indicate its Larmor frequency. Now, let's imagine that we have multiple protons. Look at where they are in the field. They kind of all are in a similar part of the magnetic field, right? They all are over sort of this kind of dark gray area. So probably these protons, for the most part, all have the same Larmor frequency. They're all resonating at the same Larmor frequency, which is why they're all the same color, the same shade of orange. So if you were to look at them at the strength, if you were to inject a radio frequency pulse, then stop the pulse, let protons resonate a little bit, and then after a certain amount of time, which we call TE, take a picture, measure how strong M0 is in the XY plane. Now, if protons are all resonating at the same Larmor frequency, the signal will probably be strong, because if they're all swinging at the same pace, it takes longer for them to lose phase or dephase. So after TE, let's say 20 milliseconds after the radio frequency pulse, if you look at how many of these are still swinging together, it probably is a good number, because they're all going at the same pace. So now let's do the following experiment. What we're going to do is we're going to take the same setup, but inside the blood vessel, we're going to inject 1% gadolinium. Now, gadolinium is a compound that is also paramagnetic, much the same as deoxyhemoglobin. So if you put gadolinium inside a magnetic field, it will distort the magnetic field. And you can kind of see that, because see this little white shaded area right here, and in fact, right here. And it's tough to see, but there's a little darker shaded area right here and right here. Remember, I told you that the shade of gray in this image represent how strong the magnetic field is. So if we add gadolinium inside the blood vessel, it will create a warping in the magnetic field around it. So if we look at the same protons as before, it might turn out that maybe these 6 protons are still in almost the same magnetic field. So they still all have the same Larmor frequency. They still are resonating at the same Larmor frequency. But these 2 protons are in a slightly different magnetic field. As a result, their Larmor frequency will be different, maybe a little faster, maybe a little slower. So now we have 6 protons all going at the same Larmor frequency and 2 going at a different frequency. So compared to before, compared to this state where we had very little gadolinium, do you think these protons, if at TE, so again, we put in the radio frequency pulse, we stop the radio frequency pulse, we wait 20 milliseconds, so we wait for protons to swing for 20 milliseconds. Now let's look at the signal. After 20 milliseconds, would you imagine that these protons are more or less dephased than these protons? Well, probably more, right? Because here there are 2 protons that are going at a completely Larmor frequency. So obviously, at least those 2 protons will have dephased quite a bit compared to the other protons that are all going at the same pace. So as we add gadolinium, and as we make the magnetic field more uneven, so less smooth, as we often say, protons will dephase faster. So by the time I take the picture at TE, the strength of the magnetic of M0 that they create will have died down a little more than when the magnetic field was entirely smooth. Okay, let's add a little more gadolinium. Now we have 2% gadolinium. And you can see, so the gadolinium is inside the blood vessel. And you can see that now it's creating these really strong distortions all around. So if I were to take the same 8 protons, maybe these 4, with respect to each other, are still in the same magnetic field. And so they will be resonating at the same Larmor frequency. But now we have these 2 protons and these 2 protons all in different magnetic fields, right? Because these 4 now live inside the distortions created by gadolinium. So now we have 4 protons going at the same resonant frequency and 4 protons in pairs of 2 going at completely different resonant frequencies. They're going at different Larmor frequencies. So once again, we inject the radio frequency pulse, we stop the radio frequency pulse, we let protons swing a little bit, let's say 20 milliseconds, TE, and then we snap a picture and we look how strong the signal is now. Would you imagine that these would have dephased more or less compared to 1% or 0.5%? Well, certainly more, because now we have 4 protons all going at the same Larmor frequency, and then other 4 going at different Larmor frequencies. So the protons will certainly, after the same 20 milliseconds, after the same TE, the protons will certainly have dephased a little bit more. And finally, you can put in 4% gadolinium, and you can see that it creates these really large inhomogeneities in the magnetic field. So the situation is pretty much the same as before. Who knows, maybe these now start being in different magnetic fields. For our purposes, let's even just imagine that these 4 are still in the same magnetic field with respect to each other, but these will now be in completely different magnetic fields. Maybe, right? Maybe these 2 will be resonating much faster than the other protons, so their Larmor frequency might be much higher than the other protons. These 2 protons might be resonating at much lower Larmor frequencies. So now, again, we inject radio frequency pulse, we stop the radio frequency pulse, we let the protons resonate for 20 milliseconds, then we look at how in phase are they. Well, these protons probably will go very much out of phase very quickly. So the more distorted the field is, in our case, 4% gadolinium, the faster protons will lose coherence, the faster they will dephase. On the other hand, the more smooth the field is, the less inhomogeneities, the more the protons will go together. So the stronger the signal will be after any TE, after, let's say, 20 milliseconds. Okay, so to us, the important message is that if the field is distorted, then protons dephase fast and the signal is small. If the magnetic field is smooth and even, then protons are all resonating at the same pace, at the same Larmor frequency. Therefore, after any TE, compared to the 4% gadolinium, the signal will always be stronger. To us, again, the important aspect is the relationship between how smooth the field is and how strong the signal is when we measure it. Now, you can also look at this, obviously, the previous example was with gadolinium, but deoxygenated hemoglobin does the exact same thing. So imagine you have the exact same scenario, and I know it's hard to see, but in here, there's the little cylinder, the little blood vessel. If the blood is 90% oxygenated, then there is very little distortion around, and all the protons will probably be resonating at the same frequency. As you remove oxygenated hemoglobin in favor of deoxygenated hemoglobin, you see that by the time you're at 60%, you start seeing a magnetic field warping around here. If you go to 30%, you see even a larger warping, which means that protons will be going at different Larmor frequencies, which means the signal will be weaker. And finally, at 0% oxygen saturation, you start getting these much larger warpings in the field. So same thing, be it gadolinium, be it oxygen saturation, meaning being deoxygenated hemoglobin, the more warping in the field, the more protons are resonating at different frequencies, the weaker the signal when we measure it. So if you want to think of it this way, for us, in terms of brain activity, you can imagine that at rest, maybe it doesn't match exactly the numbers of what happens in the human brain, but you can imagine that at rest, there's a lot of warping in the field, so protons dephase rather fast. And then when you engage in a mental activity, whichever part of the brain has increased neural activity, because of the increase in oxygenation of that part of the brain, it will essentially smooth the field, right? There'll be more oxygen, so less deoxygenated hemoglobin, which will make the field much smoother, which will make protons go more together. It will make protons go resonate at a much more similar Larmor frequency, and so the signal will be stronger. So that's how BOLD works. Essentially, we go from rest, where there's a lot of deoxygenated hemoglobin, and so protons dephase fast, to a condition of an active condition, when there's much less deoxyhemoglobin, and therefore protons resonate more together, and therefore the signal is stronger. And finally, also important noting that MRI machines of different strengths give rise to different amount of warping in the field, given the same amount of gadolinium or deoxyhemoglobin. So if you were to have a certain amount of deoxyhemoglobin in a 0.5 Tesla or gadolinium in a 0.5 Tesla, it doesn't create a lot of distortion. Now, if you take the exact same amount of deoxyhemoglobin or gadolinium and put it in a 1.5 Tesla, now you start seeing distortions. If you put that same amount in a 3 Tesla machine, the distortion is much stronger, and so on and so forth. Here's a 4 Tesla. You can see that the same amount of gadolinium, the same amount of deoxyhemoglobin creates a much larger, a much more visible warping in the field. So that's why for us, having a stronger magnetic field, having a stronger MRI is advantageous, because we can see small changes in the deoxyhemoglobin much better with a stronger magnetic field. So if we had a 7 Tesla MRI machine, we might be able to see much more minute changes in the amounts of concentration of deoxyhemoglobin in somebody's brain as they engage in a mental activity. So finally, so to show it in a different way, this is the exact same model that I showed earlier. And this sort of carpet that you're seeing represents the strength of the magnetic field in any pixel of this image. So for example, you might imagine that we have two protons right here, and they are in a certain magnetic field, but because in here there is deoxyhemoglobin, see, it creates this big warping in the field right now. The field is not homogeneous at all. And so these two protons might be resonating at a certain Larmor frequency, whereas these two protons will be resonating at a very different Larmor frequency. Now let me ask you this. If we were to take this exact model, so think of this exact picture, let's say that the brain suddenly this part of the brain becomes active and a lot of oxygen goes there. In fact, you know what? There's no more deoxygenated hemoglobin in this piece of the brain once somebody starts doing a mental activity. Of course, that's not what happens in a human brain, but just for the example, imagine that you have this piece of the brain. Suddenly, we fill this piece of the brain with only oxygenated hemoglobin. There's no more deoxygenated hemoglobin. What do you think this image would look like? What would this graph look like if it were 100% oxygenated hemoglobin, 0% deoxygenated hemoglobin? What would it look like?